Chris sneered as he stated, "You country high school graduates can stop coming tomorrow." As he talked, the high-ranking executive cast a disdainful glance at me. He had detested me since I entered the company, since I had just completed high school, and he was the biggest education snob there. Chris's abrupt remark caused everyone around us to start muttering, but my response quickly put an end to the muttering. "Thank you very much," I responded abruptly, expressing my gratitude. "What?" Chris appeared perplexed, but I went on with my next statement, and that's when things started to go in a different direction. "I'm David, and I'm 40 years old. I am an internal specialist in the Systems Management Division of Amakusa Corp., a sizable trading corporation. My primary responsibility is overseeing the organization's business and core processes, which are not immediately related to sales, to manage the diverse range of inquiries and concerns from staff members, particularly when interacting with more senior staff members who are less tech-savvy. I also need to have excellent communication skills. Younger workers can manage things on their own if I offer them a handbook, or they tend to recall after being shown once. But the older men don't do that. They repeatedly and shamelessly pose the same question, and no matter how much time goes by, they are still unable to recall the fundamentals, instead of making an effort to learn. Some people even criticize the machines, claiming that there are always issues or that it is too difficult to comprehend. This attitude is more noticeable the higher they are in their position, and the more educated they appear to be, the more obstinate they appear. But this kind of whining is pointless. I am appreciative of this organization for hiring me 10 years ago. Furthermore, disparaging elderly men is like spitting in the wind. Younger people already perceive me to be an old guy at 40. Sarah, my daughter in the 8th grade, recently surprised me by stating, "You've aged." However, if I'm going to be elderly, I want to be someone that younger people like. I was the only person with specialist abilities when I started working for the company 10 years ago, and the systems management division was brand new. The others were merely computer-literate individuals from other departments. Prior to that, I worked alongside other IT professionals in a system development company, putting in long hours from dawn to dusk. From the outside, however, it appeared to be a monotony, with no weekends off and lengthy hours that may be referred to as black conditions. Steve, a friend from middle school and the son of the president of Amakusa Corp., called me as I was wondering whether there was a more manageable job out there. I currently work for my dad's business. He first offered, "How about helping me out if you're up for it?" At a class reunion. I instantly answered, "Sure," after having a few beers and feeling excited to see an old friend. I was unaware that it was the large corporation Amakusa Corp. When we were students, Steve never brought up anything like that. We were just youngsters hanging out at my house, mostly playing video games. The fact that he was the president's son startled me. Steve was the one who established the systems management division and insisted that the business handle all of its systems in-house rather than contracting out. He returned to an IT trade school after leaving a prominent university. He left university to acquire the technological abilities required to modernize Amakusa Corp., which was still lagging, in addition to the fact that the lectures weren't fun. Steve took the initiative to lead the charge because the senior management, including his father, the president, didn't recognize the value of IT and weren't acting appropriately. "Steve, I'm amazed at how hard you work for your family's business." I told him, "That's really something." "It's not that impressive," he said, laughing at what I had said. "I think it's more admirable that you're working hard and raising a family." Steve is so committed to the business that he is still unmarried, which seems wasteful given that he is attractive, intelligent, and qualified to attend a prestigious institution. However, he asserts, "I am the one who must represent Amakusa Corp. Right now, that's my main concern, so I need your assistance, David." I accepted his invitation to join Amakusa Corp. And am currently working hard as the main person in the systems management division. My desk phone rang one day as I was about to leave the workplace early. I discovered it was from Chris when I returned. Chris has reportedly worked for Amakusa Corp. For more than 20 years and has known the president since their college days. I frequently dealt with Chris, even though regular staff don't typically communicate with executives. He phones our department, which serves as the company's PC help desk, a lot for minor problems, which is why. As I was ready to take up the receiver, I thought, not again, with a tired expression. But I was halted by Steve, who was close. I'll take care of it. Sarah's birthday is today, correct? Go ahead and leave. You have preparations to do. Actually, I was leaving early to host a party for Sarah's birthday. At my previous job, I never would have thought to leave early for something like this. However, family matters are given priority here, particularly in the systems management department. When I become president someday, I want to make sure everyone can easily make time for their families, Steve says frequently. Thanks, I really appreciate it. After thanking Steve, I was ready to leave. Even though I could hear Chris's voice over the phone, I pretended not to hear it as I exited the office. Is there some absurd reason why David is going early? I could really hear Chris's voice in my mind as I said, "This is why I can't stand these high school graduates from the countryside. I came from a rural area and graduated high school, so he always had it out for me." I instructed Chris to leave a message for non-urgent issues because he would contact me several times a day for unimportant reasons that interfered with my work. If not, my staff would have to find me when I wasn't at my desk, which would be inconvenient. The calls eventually stopped, but he then began sending irrelevant texts. In an obvious attempt to make fun of me, the high school graduate, he would include links to articles and videos, most of which were scholarly papers or content from prestigious universities. "I hear you have a daughter," he once commented. A needless link to a website of a prominent girls' school is included with the statement, "Even girls should receive a proper education in today's world. It's not like when we were young," acting as though those who didn't attend a prestigious university weren't even human. Chris had always been fixated with academic credentials. He has always been like way. I dropped out of college, therefore he doesn't think well of me either. He undoubtedly secretly believes that I'm unfit to lead Amakusa Corp, but we only need to wait a little while more because he will be retiring in a few months. In addition to overseeing the systems division and getting ready to take over as president, Steve also found it difficult to handle Chris. "Steve, you've had it harder than I do. You need to pay closer attention to your position. Just a couple more months." I reassured Steve by giving him a pat on the back. However, Chris stated something surprising to me one day. He came to present Richard, his son-in-law, who had recently joined the company. Richard, wearing a stylish suit, stated, "I look forward to working with everyone to help Amakusa Corp grow." He and Chris both graduated from the same esteemed university. He studied management at a business school abroad after graduation. Before Chris suggested that he join Amakusa Corp, he worked at a consulting firm. "You don't have to be so stiff, Richard. The majority of those working in this field are not very educated." When Chris said they think they're important just because they know a bit more about computers than the rest of us, the group fell into a tight stillness. More about computers, perhaps? To work here, we'd spend years honing specialized abilities. This business would have lagged behind its rivals in terms of AT development if Steve and I hadn't been here. The ones who had no idea how the times were changing back then were the older guys resting on their academic laurels. I went on. "With all due respect, Chris, the sales team at Amakusa Corp wouldn't even be able to get in touch with customers if our department didn't support the operations. The majority of company transactions now take place online. You can't perform your work effectively if you can't use a computer." Chris's face showed a slight frown at my words. He probably wanted to get much angrier, but maybe he was holding back in front of his son-in-law. Forcing an awkward smile, he pointed at me and said, "You high school grads from the countryside can stop coming tomorrow." "Chris, that's going too far." Steve, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. But Chris, dreaming that his son-in-law might become the next president, was emboldened even towards Steve. "You high school grads sticking together. How touching. Unlike you two, Richard is an elite. Even if you two are gone, the company will be just fine as long as he's here." Hearing that made my blood boil. I couldn't tolerate the insult aimed at Steve. "Thank you very much." I practically yelled, appreciating deeply. The whole room went silent in shock. Chris, Steve, Richard, and the other employees all stared at me in surprise. What? What's going on? What are you saying? Chris looked at me puzzled, but I shot back even more forcefully. I've hated coming to this company for a long time, so I'm relieved you told me not to come anymore. That's why I said thank you. Seeing him dumbfounded, I immediately continued. Honestly, Chris, it's been a hassle that you still can't figure out basic PC operations. You've called me multiple times a day, disrupting my work, and for someone from a prestigious university, you have the worst memory I've ever seen. Even elementary school kids handle computers better. Chris's face turned red as he shot back. What did you say? You think you can talk to me like that? You told me not to come tomorrow, right? So we're no longer in a boss-employee relationship. To be frank, if you weren't my boss, you'd just be an outdated old man. I have absolutely no respect for you. As soon as I finished, Steve burst out laughing. You're going too far, though I have to admit you're right. The way you poke at the keyboard with one finger, it's like watching a monkey. Steve pointed at Chris, laughing. I felt a bit bad about the monkey comment, but I recently saw a news story about chimps using smartphones, so maybe it wasn't that far-fetched. If you avoid new technology and just brag about your past skills, even a chimp could surpass you. What? How dare you talk to me like that? Chris, now even more enraged after Steve's words, flared up. I wasn't finished. I aimed to shut him up completely. You should learn about literacy too. Stop sending me videos and articles pushing your academic elitism. And lately, you've even started lecturing me on how to educate my daughter. You know, we live in a time when crossing into someone's private life can get you sued. What? He went that far with you? Steve asked, surprised. Yeah, he's been going on about how even girls need an education these days. If you tweeted about this, it'd blow up. In an L-forward country like the US, low internet literacy is seen as a lack of character, right? Richard suddenly pulled into the conversation, glanced nervously at Chris before answering, yes, in the US, the laws around that kind of thing are very strict. Chris's flushed face began to turn pale. Apparently, what his son-in-law Richard said had the biggest impact on him. Chris adored his daughter so much that he'd even send me pictures of the two of them together. He was probably careful not to upset Richard because he didn't want his daughter to hate him. As a father with a daughter myself, I understood the feeling, but his desperation seemed ridiculous. But don't worry. I'm not going to bother with something as tedious as a lawsuit, and as you said, I won't be coming to the office starting tomorrow. As I said that, Steve nodded and chimed in. If David is leaving, I'm leaving too. After all, I'm the one who invited him to this company. But with an elite like Richard here, you don't need us, right? As we grabbed our bags to leave, Richard, in a panic, turned to Chris. Father-in-law, I don't know the full story since I just got here, but shouldn't you try to stop them? However, Chris, too stubborn to back down, snapped, I don't care if they want to quit. Let them. Dealing with a hard-headed old man like him is a real hassle, I thought, feeling for poor Richard, having this guy as a father-in-law. With those thoughts in mind, Steve and I quickly left the company. The next day, the stubborn old man who kicked us out cold relentlessly tried to contact us, but we ignored him completely. I haven't even looked at the 20 messages he sent. In truth, the reason Chris was so desperate to get through was because the company's management system had crashed. But the system's management team is full of talented people, and they quickly handled the recovery. What's really concerning Chris isn't the system failure, but the fact that the team is boycotting him. Of course, the whole thing was staged. There was no actual system failure. It was a calculated move to make sure there were no disruptions to business. Our goal with this plan was to finally make Chris reflect on all the times he's interrupted our work. Right about now, Chris is probably getting grilled by everyone for forcing us out. If something like this happens again, even Dad won't be able to ignore it. He's always been too lenient with Chris just because they're old friends. We never intended to actually quit the company. The one who should leave is Chris, not us. We want the president to recognize that and apologize for letting it get to this point. As Steve and I headed back to the company, he grinned and said, "Hey David, this reminds me of middle school. Remember? We rebelled against our teacher, and the whole class boycotted the gym teacher's orders. Yeah, that was 25 years ago, I replied, laughing. At the time, I was attending the local middle school, and that's when Steve transferred in. I'd always wondered why a city boy like Steve suddenly ended up in our rural town. Turns out it was because of his bad behavior. Apparently, Steve was such a troublemaker that he caused endless headaches for every teacher at his old school, and no adult could handle him. His father, at his wits' end, sent Steve to live with his grandparents in the countryside as a form of suspension. Just as the rumors said, Steve wasted no time causing trouble for the rural teachers from day one with his blunt and outspoken nature. While other students treated Steve like he was untouchable, I secretly liked him. Steve's words brilliantly pointed out the contradictions of the adults around us, and he wasn't wrong. But there are very few adults who can admit when they're wrong, especially teachers. They tend to be harsh with students who challenge their authority. That's true in both the city and the countryside. I just never had the courage to say out loud what I was thinking, so I grew up carrying that frustration toward the adults around me. Then something happened that became the turning point for Steve and me to become friends. It happened during gym class. At the time, I was physically weak and not good at sports, but the gym teacher, who seemed to have muscles for brains, always shouted harsh words at me when I struggled to keep up. "Hey, David, don't slack off. Run like you mean it." But no matter how much he yelled, I was already doing my best, and I wasn't slacking at all. One day, I couldn't take it anymore, so I stopped running and sat down. The teacher rushed over to me with a furious expression. "David, don't sit down. I'll hold everyone responsible. No one will play soccer until you start running. Everyone will spend the rest of gym class running laps." At that moment, the entire class sighed in frustration. Some even shot me looks of contempt. Feeling humiliated, I stood up again, but my legs felt weak. "What's the matter, David? Are you going to make everyone suffer?" I glanced at the teacher's face, and it almost looked like he was smiling. It gave me chills. I was terrified and didn't know what to do. Almost on the verge of panicking, that's when Steve stepped in. "What you're doing, teacher, isn't teaching or educating. You're just taking out your personal frustrations and dragging others into it, making David the target of everyone's anger. It's a very cowardly move." The teacher's face turned red with anger at Steve's sharp words. "What did you say? Who do you think you're talking to? Obviously, I'm talking to you. Or are you implying that because you're a teacher and an authority figure, students like me aren't allowed to talk back? Even so, I'm still talking to you. Please listen properly." The teacher, now furious, turned toward the other students and yelled, "Everyone, we're running laps for the rest of the class." The whole class fell silent in shock, but Steve wasn't finished. "No, we're playing soccer. It says right in today's class schedule that we're supposed to play soccer. I even told my grandma this morning how excited I was to play soccer with everyone. How do you think she'll feel if she hears we couldn't play just because the teacher was in a bad mood?" Steve suddenly wore a sad expression, which only made the teacher more irritated. "Don't mock me. You're just a kid spouting off like you know everything." Steve, still calm, shot back at the angry teacher. By this time, the tension in the room had eased, and our classmates began paying more attention to Steve's words. Calling it spouting off for a kid? Was that supposed to be a joke? It's not funny. "Come on, let's start the soccer game, everyone." "Hey, wait. Don't act on your own just then," the vice principal, hearing the commotion, arrived. "What's going on here? Your voices are echoing throughout the school." Seeing a higher-up, the teacher's face quickly shifted to an awkward smile. "Vice principal, well, we've had a bit of an issue." Steve calmly stepped between the teacher and the vice principal. The teacher was forcing weak-bodied David to run, so I stepped in to stop it. And then the teacher threatened to cancel soccer and make everyone run laps. It felt like something out of the old military days. Using collective punishment to make students follow orders doesn't seem right. The vice principal, looking troubled, glanced between the two before speaking. "Let them play soccer. It's not a teacher's role to take away students' enjoyment. Besides, what he said makes sense. In the end, we played soccer that day. From that day on, no one treated Steve like a troublemaker anymore, and I became friends with him over our shared love of video games. Come to think of it, we'd been interested in computers ever since back then. But when middle school ended, so did our time together. Steve was called back by his father and ended up going to a high school in the city. Back then, there was no email or social media. Once someone left, there was a chance you'd never see them again. It was painful to think of parting with Steve, my first real friend, but I tried to stay positive, reminding myself that he had his own life to live. Besides, maybe Steve was happy to leave this rural place. He didn't seem the least bit sad about parting with me. Was it possible that Steve didn't see me as much of a friend as I thought? That doubt began to eat away at me, and for the last month, I started avoiding him. Looking back now, I realize how childish that was. Then the day of our farewell finally came. Just when I was debating whether to go see him off, Steve came to me. "David, thanks for everything. At first, I hated the idea of living in this countryside, but you made it fun. I really don't want to leave, but I've got my own things to deal with. But we'll always be friends, okay?" His words, spoken with a smile, erased all my doubts. At the same time, the embarrassment and sadness of avoiding him began to rise within me. Steve, I tried to put my feelings into words, but nothing came out right. Steve looked at me with a kindness I had never seen before. "We'll meet again for sure." All I could do was nod in response to his words. After that, I graduated from high school and moved to the city to attend a trade school. When my daughter, Sarah, was born, I became more aware of my responsibilities as a father. But I also overworked myself and ended up getting sick. It was during one of the most difficult times in my life that I reunited with Steve. As I reflected on the past, we arrived at the company. When we walked into the systems management office, we found Chris, the president, and others all glaring at each other. Even Richard was there. I felt sorry for getting him caught up in this mess right after joining the company. In my mind, I silently apologized to him. "What the hell is going on here?" Chris barked as soon as he saw us, leaving Steve and me utterly exasperated. Even now, he's still trying to act tough. "What's going on?" "This is a situation you brought on yourself, Chris. You've been treating us poorly for a long time. You probably thought you could look down on the systems management team because we didn't graduate from prestigious universities. But now that the company relies on the systems, we've become indispensable. Enough. Just get the system back online. The company's operations are at stake. Do you want to ruin the business?" Chris, emboldened by the presence of his old friend, the president, raised his voice. However, the president's expression seemed sad. "Chris, I believe this situation is our fault. We haven't properly supported the department that's been backing us from behind the scenes." With a somber expression, the president glanced at Steve. When Steve digs his heels in like this, there's no stopping him. He's always been stubborn when he believes he's right. He's never listened to his parents, always rebelling. Even after hearing this from his father, Steve's expression didn't change. "Yeah, I hated being suddenly sent to live with my grandmother in the countryside. But now I'm grateful for it. I met irreplaceable friends there. It helped me calm down and realize what I needed to do." "Though you're still a crappy father," Steve said, this with his usual nonchalant attitude, causing the president to smile. I had never seen the two of them together before, but now that I could compare them, I realized just how similar they were. Though if I said that, Steve, who built his life rebelling against his father, might not take it well. "What do you mean, calling your father the president, crappy? I'd like to see the face of the parent who raised someone like you." Then, looking flustered, Richard interjected, That's the president you're talking about, father-in-law." "Ah," Chris, realizing his blunder, covered his mouth, his face turning pale while the president looked at him in exasperation. "I'm sorry you had to deal with a guy like this. Steve may be a wild son who doesn't listen to his parents or the adults around him, but he's got guts. I thought he might have mellowed out at 40, but now here he is stirring things up again. I'm not the same as I used to be. I'm not doing this for myself. I believe it's for everyone and for the company. I may not have the full picture of the company, but I want my team to understand the importance of standing up for what they believe in. Hearing Steve's words, I was struck by a realization. I hadn't told Steve about what Chris had been doing to me. I thought that with Steve carrying the burden of becoming the next president, I shouldn't add to his stress. But he must have sensed something. He probably felt that distance I was putting between us. I've known Steve since middle school. At first, I thought he was nothing but a troublemaker, but I was wrong. By the time we graduated, everyone admired him. I realized that Steve wasn't here to cause problems but to solve them. Before I knew it, I had said those words to the president. "You're saying Steve is here to solve this company's problems?" "Yes," the president nodded, seemingly satisfied. "I actually believe that too. I want Steve to work hard and succeed. For that, I ask for your support and the support of everyone here, including Richard. Please, I'm counting on you." As the president greeted, I responded and said, "Of course." Seeing this, Richard came beside me and greeted as well. Chris, watching with a conflicted expression, eventually let out a deep sigh as if accepting his defeat. His plan to make his son-in-law the next president had crumbled. Chris eventually retired and peace returned to the systems management department. That said, the work is still just as busy as ever. We're currently reviewing the internal systems, rebuilding, and updating where necessary. The IT world is constantly evolving with no end to the advancement of technology. Humans and computers are now inseparable in this era. I know my job will continue for a long time. Steve, on the other hand, left the systems management department and became part of the executive team. He's now entering the company's core leadership and steering its direction. But that hasn't changed our personal relationship. We remain close and trusted friends, just as we always have been. I heard from Yaki that Chris is driving his wife crazy at home. Apparently, since he's home all day, she says he's always in the way of the housework. Maybe it's better for men to stay out, working all the time. At our usual beer joint with a glass in hand, Steve said, "Yucky" is what we call Richard. Since then, I've become good friends with Richard too, and the three of us sometimes grab drinks after work. Once I got to know him, I realized that Richard is far too good for Chris, but maybe that's exactly why Chris needed him. Just like Steve appeared in my life when I was weak and couldn't do anything, Steve is my savior. I found myself saying this, and Steve flashed me that nostalgic smile. Saviors go both ways, don't they? I was surprised to think I had ever been anyone's savior. Feeling a little embarrassed, I laughed and said, "Savior is a bit much." A few years later, when Sarah, now a college student, brought her first boyfriend home, I realized that I had truly become an old man. Sarah's boyfriend was a fine young man with no obvious flaws, but I still felt uneasy. I couldn't shake that restless feeling. Even though I knew it was a happy occasion, I couldn't fully accept it because of how much I adored my daughter. Steve, still single, laughed and said, "Sounds like you've got a case of the Chris syndrome." I was annoyed at his carefree comment, feeling like I'd lost some face. By the way, I still kept in touch with Chris over social media, where we bonded over being doting dads, especially after he became a grandfather. He constantly sent pictures of his grandchild, boasting almost every day. I couldn't help but feel envious. Yet thinking about the day when Sarah would get married and leave home filled me with a different kind of pain. Chris, how did you feel when your daughter told you she was marrying Richard? That's how difficult I found it to let go of my daughter lately. Even my wife has grown tired of it and scolded me, saying, "If you keep thinking like that, Sarah's going to end up hating you." At first, it felt like my guts were being ripped out. After all, the little girl who used to say she wanted to marry Daddy was now bringing home a boyfriend. If he had been a lousy guy, I was ready to tear him apart. But Richard, he was perfect. No flaws. I had been ready to chase away any bad bugs that got close to Sarah, but the young man who came was far more capable than me and had a flawless character. But then I decided to see it this way. My daughter is teaching me what I lack as a father. The person she brings home is the version of myself I should aspire to be. Hearing that for the first time, I truly respected Chris. However, Steve, looking completely baffled, responded, "No, it just means your daughter has good taste. Don't brush it off like that. You don't understand what Chris had to go through to get past that tough situation. I never thought you'd end up sinking with Chris. Life really is unpredictable. Steve's face showed a mix of disbelief and amusement. Anyway, forget that. I've got something important to tell you. His sudden change of topic made me frown. What? Are you finally getting married? No, I'm marrying the company. It's been decided. I'll become the president of Amakusa Corp next year. I may not have all the experience, but with everyone's support, I'm going to give it my best shot. Hearing this, I felt like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I see. So Steve's finally made it to the top. What are you talking about? At the inauguration, you're going to give the speech as my best friend. You don't have time to be worrying about Sarah. He slapped me on the back, flashing that same smile he's had for years. I couldn't help but smile back as widely as I could.